My name's Andy. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm especially glad to be here this morning with you. If you haven't been with us over the last few weeks, I want to let you know what we've been talking about. We've been thinking about how we are called to a relentless commitment to the relentless love and mission of God, which is for our neighbors, our networks, for the next generation. But one of the things that we need to remember that we're talking about this month is that to be committed to this relentless mission doesn't mean that we just have our foot on the gas all the time, but rather we're called to find the right pace, a lasting pace, a rhythm to our lives. For us to be pursuing our relentless God, we have to recognize that there's an obstacle that is a risk, a danger that's before us. This danger affects us whether we are young or old, whether we're liberal or conservative, whether we are men or women, students, adults, grandparents, children. It affects all of us. It affects our minds, our bodies, our spirits. It has huge negative implications and consequences for our lives, and it's everywhere. And that is the problem of exhaustion. We are an exhausted people living in an exhausted culture, and it's destroying us. It's destroying us physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, missionally, spiritually. You can Google studies and find out all the negative health benefits and the problems that emerge when we just, out of our refusal or inability to rest. I didn't do a whole lot of research, but I did one little Google search as a test, which was I just typed into my phone, "Why am I?" just to see what comes up. And here is what I found. This is an actual screenshot from my phone. The first 4 options have something to do with why am I so tired? So it appears that a lot of people have been typing up, "Why am I so tired? Why am I always tired? Why am I so tired even though I get enough sleep?" And then the last one is, "Why am I always hungry?" which is a subject maybe we'll cover in a future sermon series. But this exhaustion is everywhere. It's all around us. I probably don't need to convince you of it. I don't need to take any more time persuading you that this is true. It's really more a matter of us figuring out what are we going to do about this reality. How do we live faithfully in an exhausted culture? And I want to know, what if there was a solution, a way to address this that didn't require any special knowledge or skill or expertise or social status? What if there was a way for us to regularly pull away from the busyness of our lives and be restored, have our tanks refilled, be restored in our bodies, our minds, our spirits, be reconnected with God and with other people, to be realigned with the purposes that God has for us? And what if that was something that we could embrace in a regular way so that we weren't just waiting for our 2 weeks or whatever it is of vacation to dump all of our rest in, which if you've ever gone on vacation, you probably know that it just has all of its own stress and busyness that comes with it. But what if we had like 52 days a year where we were invited to rest? Wouldn't that make a difference? Well, I want to invite you to look in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, with me. This is God speaking to people who have just been set free from slavery, which is one way of thinking of slavery is a condition where you are not free to rest. And so he gives them this gift, which we read in verse 8. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So here we see a similar thing that we saw last week, which is that God, in his creating of all that is, in his fashioning of reality, has woven rest to be an integral part of reality. There was the rhythm of his creation over 6 days, and then the capstone is this rest that God himself participates in. So we're reminded that rest is a part of reality, that we can't avoid it. If we pretend like it's not essential, we're just swimming upstream or like fighting gravity. It's just a part of what it means to be living in the world. But it seems like people have a really hard time living within that reality, acknowledging it. We tend to think that we can live beyond our limits. So God not only builds rest and rhythm into the way the world works, but then he also offers this commandment, not just in creation, but also in commandment, to remind us and to indicate to us that we are prone to forget what reality actually looks like. This is not because God has arbitrary rules that he wants us to follow just to show that we love him. It's actually that God wants us to live according to the way we were created to live, and rest and rhythm is an essential part of that. And so we read, God created all that is in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Because God rested, we rest. That's what this verse is saying. But that idea of God resting is a very confusing one. The Bible just says it like it's easy to understand. I mean, does this mean that God just needed to kick back with some lemonade after this huge landscaping project of creation? There's mystery to what's going on here, but one thing that's important to know is that in the ancient world, there were lots of accounts. Every religion, every culture had an account of how everything came to be. And all of them included some kind of God doing some kind of thing. But typically what would happen is at the end of whatever creative process would happen, most other cultures had the culminating moment be that God who did the creating then would finally create a temple. The temple was kind of the last step in creation, because in the ancient world, temples were where the God kind of dwelled and inhabited. This was sort of like the headquarters or control room. And so if you're an ancient person listening to this for the first time, what you're going to imagine comes on the seventh day is God building a temple. And there might be something surprising about God resting, but the truth is, this God, the God of the Bible, is creating a temple. He's just not creating a temple in a particular place or in a particular building. This God is going to show up in the rhythm of time, restful time. Time is God's temple, where he inhabits, where he shows up, where he does his work. We see this in the creation, the work of creation. We also see it in the work of God when he shows up in time and space as a human being, Jesus Christ. Jesus was always in his ministry pulling away from the crowds and the busyness of his ministry and his work to be alone in a desolate place or in prayer with his Father. Jesus practiced this rhythm of rest throughout his life. In fact, if he not only did he practice it through the course of his life, but actually, in some sense, his culminating work on the cross is the work that really sets us free to rest. Because all of a sudden, because of the cross, we no longer have to justify ourselves, prove ourselves, earn God's favor. It's offered to us as a gift. And so we see not only in the model of Jesus, but in the work of Jesus in his death, this invitation to receive the gift of rest. Because of the work of Jesus, we are invited to rest. So I have this spiritual principle that says if Jesus needs it, I need it too. And that idea has never yet failed me, but it's even more than that. Jesus did the thing that I couldn't do for myself. Jesus did something that I couldn't follow his example so that I could truly rest. So we see this in the work of creation. We see it in the work of redemption. When Jesus was in his ministry, he often would say, he would often practice rest in a way that surprised people. Because in Jesus' time, there was this system that had grown up and kind of been built around the practice of the Sabbath. The religious authorities at that time could see very clearly in their reading of the Old Testament that rest was built into the fabric of reality and that God had commanded it of his people, so they could see that it was really important, and they wanted to help make that happen. But even if their intentions were good, what resulted was this huge structure surrounding this practice of rest that made it not feel like a gift, but like a burden. And so Jesus was restoring the practice of Sabbath, the practice of rest and rhythm, into what it was intended to be. And so that meant he rested in ways that people thought he shouldn't. And he didn't rest in the ways that people thought he should. And there was lots of times he got in trouble for this. And one time they asked him directly, "Why do you and your disciples do what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus responded with this incredible phrase that I love, and I love the way the New Living Translation puts it. He says, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath." So when Jesus was restoring this idea of rest, he was offering it to us again as the gift it was intended to be. Rest is a gift for our good. And I mean that in two ways. The first thing is that rest is a foundation of a healthy life. Whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, whether you believe in God or not, you know this to be true because rest is woven into the reality of the world. And so this is why any exercise program will have days of rest, because if you don't, you will hurt yourself. We know we need to get sleep at night, and if we don't, our minds start to get foggy. If you don't believe me, just try to stay up for 3 straight days and let me know how it goes. It's also why our best ideas come to us when we're driving in the car or in the shower or about to fall asleep, because our brains are given the opportunity to rest. And so in terms of our physical bodies and our minds and our emotions and our spirits, rest is the foundation to a healthy life. But there's actually even more going on here, I think. The Bible is showing us and reminding us that rest is also the foundation of the spiritual life. And it's in the very same way, rest helps us link up our spiritual lives with our physical, mental, and emotional lives. We see that we're integrated, created beings. If we refuse rest, it doesn't only hurt us physically, though it does, but it also affects us spiritually, because what rest is the opportunity for us to remember and declare before God, before ourselves, before other people, that we are not omnipotent, limitless, all-powerful beings, but that we are frail, vulnerable, tired, needy creatures that need to be restored. And it's really important to remember that you are not God if you are going to relate to God. That's why this is the foundation of the spiritual life, because if we get that mixed up, we're never going to get started at all. So rest is the original spiritual practice. I love that before God asked his people, before he had anything about feasts and festivals they were to celebrate, or tabernacles and temples they were supposed to build, or a system of sacrifices that they were supposed to follow, he tells them to do this one thing that will make them distinctive from all the other people around them, that will set them apart as God's people, and that is to take one day and not do any work on it. That's it. I love that the first spiritual practice God tells his people to do is to stop. We live in a world awash in suggestions of self-help or spiritual practices that will help us grow in our life with God. And many of them are good things. I have this book in my office that has no less than 76 spiritual practices as suggestions. So things like praying, reading your Bible, seeing a spiritual director, doing yoga, meditating, journaling, finding an accountability partner, doing a prayer walk. There's all kinds of helpful suggestions, but maybe it's just me. I know that I even have trouble at a restaurant if the menu has more than like 10 items on it. It starts to overwhelm me. But when I see a list of 76 things I need to do to get close to God, it just feels like a crushing burden. And I think I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do all those things right. This is never going to actually work for me. And so it's such a gift for me to hear that the main thing behind all of those other things, actually what we have to do for any of those things to take root, is actually to just set aside our work. So rest is a spiritual practice. Rest is not selfish. It's not selfishness. It's not laziness. It is faithfulness to God. And so we are invited to remember the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath. This emphasis here is, for me, in this moment, is on that last part of the Sabbath. There is this gift of a whole day that God gives his people, where he says, I will take care of your week. I will take care of it if you will set aside this one day on which you set aside your work. For many of us, a Sunday works for this because we may not have work. We're already planning to come to be with other people, and that God already has a part of that day. So maybe Sunday works really well for you. For me, it's Thursday sundown to Friday sundown. It's been really helpful for me to remember that the ancient practice of the Sabbath actually started in the evening, because then it means that the first thing you do as you're observing rest is you actually go to sleep. And as one of a pastor I once heard said, this is stuck in my mind, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap. Because we are embodied, frail creatures, sometimes we just need to rest instead of doing anything else. So I think that to practice this weekly rhythm of taking a day and setting aside the work that we do those other 6 days, whatever that is, whether it's answering emails or folding laundry or doing homework, whatever that might be, we set it aside for a day, and we keep it holy. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, when the Bible is talking about created things and calling them holy, it's not necessarily saying that that thing is flawless or perfect. It means that it's set aside for God's purposes. Created holy things are set aside for God's purposes. And so that's what this day is. It's a day that we set aside so that we might be set aside for God's purposes. Once we clear that space through a rhythm of rest, God can bring forth new life in us. So we remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. The other thing I think we do is, if we want to practice this rhythm of rest in our lives, is that we keep it simple. It's amazing how much work it takes to figure out what is work and what isn't. But I bet most of us just know internally what are the things that feel like a gift. What are the things in our lives that would meet our needs, as Jesus said the Sabbath is for? What are the things that would refill us? It's going to be different for everyone, but I think we know what it might be. Maybe it's taking an hour to be by yourself and pray. Maybe it's taking an hour to wander through the woods. Maybe it's taking time to wander through the aisles of Target without a kid with you. No offense to any kids who are here. But the point is not to make this difficult and confusing. The point is to pursue the things that bring us life and see what God does when we do that. We remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy, by keeping it simple, and then lastly, by keeping it up. There is a lot of good that can come from taking one day off, but the Sabbath isn't like some flu shot that you get it once and it takes care of your whole year. This is a rhythm that we are called to embrace and live into. And so one day might restore you, but a year of this rhythm will probably transform you. Because what happens when we begin to live with this priority, living with a rhythm of rest, we find ourselves actually coming to life in different ways. And we find that the Sabbath, that rhythm of rest doesn't just stay confined to the day that we're resting, but it begins to spill out into the other 6 days where we work and where we live and work, and that those other 6 days begin to help us lead up into Sabbath. It becomes a whole way of being, a posture of rest that defines who we are, not one of harried anxiety or busy attempts to prove ourselves, but a satisfied, peaceful rest that fills every day. There's a great theologian, philosopher named Abraham Joshua Heschel who said about the Sabbath, and I love this quote, "If there is no Sabbath on Wednesday, then there will be no Sabbath on Saturday." This rhythm of rest is something that is for our week, but it is also for our days and for our years. It's something that can really change everything about our lives. So we've seen rest is natural. It was woven into the reality, the fabric of creation. So rest is natural, but it does not come naturally. We are so prone to forget our limits and our needs, or to deny our limits and our needs, and I think that's why this commandment begins with the word remember. Remember the Sabbath, because we are prone to forget it. And I don't know about you, but the way I remember things is by writing it down, or by putting a reminder on my phone, or by putting it on my calendar. If I don't do those things, I will not remember. And so we need tools to help us do this. And at the end of your rows, there are some tools that if you haven't already taken them to doodle during the sermon, I invite you to pass it down so that everybody has one. These are these tools we're putting before you this month. It's called a rhythm of life, and it's just a simple invitation to think about different aspects of your life and ask yourself how you might embrace, practically speaking, in a way that works for you, a step towards this life that God calls us to. And so each week we're kind of highlighting one of them and inviting you to think about what might be something that you could pursue in a daily rhythm, in a weekly rhythm, and in a yearly rhythm. And the last 2 weeks have kind of covered, this week and last week have kind of covered the first two ones, categories of our life with God and our life with ourselves. We remember through the Sabbath that we need time to be with God, and that it is a spiritual thing to tend to our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, relational lives. And that rest is the thing that clears that space for us to do it. So you might put in the daily box, you might say, I want to read a psalm every day. I think I can do that. Or you might write, I want to make sure I get 8 hours of sleep every night. That's a rhythm that would bring me to life in a new way. Weekly, you might say, I want to make sure that gathering with God's people is a priority. Or you might say, I need to tend to my emotional life, and so I'm going to see a counselor once a week. For yearly, you might say, I want to read the whole Bible in a year. Or you might say, I want to run a marathon this year. It's not just goal setting, but it's inviting us to think practically about how to build these rhythms into our lives so that we might experience God showing up in the temple of time that he offers us in the Sabbath.